Thank you for that wonderful introduction, Margaret. I need coffee. I'm sure you do too. Thank you so much for getting up early for this address. I hope that I just don't disappoint, and even more, I hope that I don't offend. I have to say at the outset that I have no special expertise or qualifications that make me any more qualified than any of you to talk about the state of our field. In fact, if you don't like this talk, you can blame my friend Joel DeVoskin, who has been encouraging me for years and years to think bigger. Think bigger, Jen. With that confession, though, I thought I'd just use a little bit of time today to highlight something that's been bothering me a bit lately, and I am certainly not the first. A number of presidents in our past have made similar comments about the need to really broaden our field. So I plan to reiterate some of those comments and make some suggestions about why it is more important now than ever to do this. I want to start with what I don't mean by the title. What I do not mean is that we have addressed only small problems or have done so only reactively. You're at a conference where you're seeing that we are doing incredible work on a number of fronts. I can borrow a quote from Michael Sachs, who published an article titled "The Law Does Not Live by Eyewitness Testimony Alone." This was an article that he published some time ago. And as I mentioned, other past presidents, Heilbrunn, Ogloff, Otto, Resch, et cetera, have really hit this topic. But Sachs, because this was a delicate issue, used the following preamble, which I will use as well. He said, "I do not mean to say that the research that has been done ought not to have been done, that it has not made a contribution to the field or to the law, that it should not continue, or that it has not been done interestingly and well." We have lots of signs of having done things interestingly and well. We're having remarkable success on a number of fronts. The first is just simple growth. APLS was established in 1969, and over the past 44 years, it has grown tremendously in size. We now have over 3,000 members. We have specialty ethics, journals, textbooks. About half of undergrad texts now have, or undergrad psychology departments now offer some kind of course in psychology and law. And as Costanzo and Krauss said in their textbook, which is wonderful, this is clearly a boom time for the field. So we have grown. And it is also very clear that we have grown in one major area over the past 30 years. The largest area of growth really is in the clinical forensic area. Forensic psychology was recognized as a specialty practice by APA in 2001. We have a lot of opportunities for special training at the graduate, postgraduate level. We have very smart and dedicated and passionate people in our organization who have really worked hard to ensure that we do high quality work in this area. And I believe that that will continue. I also believe that this is a very thriving area, and if it has not already become so, will soon become a marketplace in itself, where people are catering to practice. I also think that it is unquestionable that we have had clear impact on policy and practice. And you can see that if you look at our two most studied areas. So we know eyewitness research, the subject of Michael Sachs' article, has been translated into police procedures that can increase the accuracy of witness evidence. It has had major impact throughout the country. Similarly, there's been an explosion of forensic assessment tools that really increase clinicians' ability to help the courts make decisions about all kinds of issues, from competence to stand trial to criminal responsibility, and most notably to forecast who is likely to be violent in the future. This is, we didn't know that much 30 years ago about dangerousness, and now we have a wealth of tools available for clinicians to help them do their work. We've also written some high impact white papers or scientific review papers in our field that really represent deep areas of research. One has been on eyewitnesses, another on confession, and we have one underway now on really exciting work that focuses on child witnesses. So I have no doubt that we will survive and thrive as a field, but my goal is to get us to think about what shape we want our field to take, and to take personal and organizational action to really arrive at the shape that we would like to have. My emphasis in saying that we tend to focus on narrow topics is much more focused on our scholarship, which I think defines us as an organization, than our practice necessarily. So that's going to be my focus today. To get a very rough, this is quick and dirty shot of the breadth of our field in terms of what we're seeing topically, I looked at the past 100 or so articles that have been published in Law and Human Behavior, which is our flagship journal. It is certainly not our only journal, but looking at the topics that we have now allows comparisons with past analyses that Rich and Mark Small have done to give us a sense of how have we changed in recent years. You can see that the journal invites topics that are really quite broad and very interdisciplinary. To give you the bottom line, I basically read the results here as indicating that we are better but not well in terms of breadth. We are certainly better in the sense that in earlier surveys, the majority of articles focused on juries and eyewitnesses. Now there appears to be greater emphasis on risk assessment and other forensic assessment. You see that those are two of the most common areas. And there are definitely important additions, including more developmental work on child witnesses and juvenile justice, and even a handful of articles on treatment, which is really exciting to those of us who have complained long and loud about how little we focus on problem solving in the clinical forensic domain. Most of the treatment articles focus on program evaluations and offenders with serious mental illness, but it's still a step in the right direction. The not well sense is that the bottom lines of some of the earlier reviews still apply to some extent to where we are now. That is, we tend to focus mostly on, quote, criminal law, criminal procedure, evidence-related concerns, jury issues, and mental health law topics. Which brings us back to the question of what we want our field to be. I think Sachs in 1986 summarized it quite well when he said, "To be a field that studies law and human behavior is a grand and noble enterprise. To be a field that knows more than anyone would want to ask about a narrow assortment of issues is, to put it lightly, less grand." So I debated a while about whether to share this crazy metaphor with you that kept appearing to me as I was thinking about this talk, but I've decided to do so. I can lighten this up a little bit and ask you if you know the story of Horton Heard a Who? I have a 2-year-old who rules the world, and this means that Disney is all of the cinema and Dr. Seuss is all of the literary genius in our household lately. So I know all about Horton Hears a Who. And this is the reason. This is Lena, who loves this story. This is Whoville. It is a vibrant community that is filled with kind, smart people who depend on and really inform each other. Think of us here at this meeting. We are connecting, we're sharing exciting ideas that advance our world of research and practice. But the thing is that all of the Whos in Whoville live on a dust speck, which is located on this clover. The world is invisible to the big animals in the forest, but the exception to that is Horton, who is an elephant who has very large ears, who one day hears a who. The Whos, though, have to make a serious racket for the other animals in the forest to know that they exist, and that's how they help Horton save their world. Again, that's a loose association, and I am certainly not saying that our discipline is a spec. I am saying that we need to, if we can, avoid overspecialization. In evolutionary or biological terms, overspecialization refers to something that's so adapted to function in a specific environment that it has little ability to withstand change. Coming back to our bigger issue, specialization is really a double-edged sword. There are aspects of specialization that are necessary and good for our field. It's sort of an inevitable consequence of increased knowledge in any area. You will necessarily attract people to that area and address deeper and hopefully different questions on that topic. Also, to be of help to the courts, it's sort of obvious that forensic experts need specialized knowledge to be of assistance. At the same time, we risk with overspecialization becoming too insular so that our connection to and relevance for the larger fields of law and policy and psychological science become limited. And specialization is not the wave of the future. For those of you who have been paying attention to what's going on in science, there's a lot more focus on interdisciplinarity, which is what we strive for, I think, and sometimes achieve. But it's summed up by an Adventures in Academia column at Stanford. So Danny Crichton noted, today the trend is not to further disintegration of the disciplines into smaller pockets, but rather the reintegration of disciplines into larger areas of knowledge. Neuroeconomics, for example, is not a new discipline, but a unifying one of two social sciences. The people who will make the largest impact in these fields are not the ones who are trapped in one area, but those who can see the connections among multiple paradigms. So what I would like to do, relatively briefly, is just talk about three things that we might focus on to increase our breadth, and obviously just interdisciplinary, and really avoid overspecialization. One of the things that I'd like to talk about is the audience that we target. If you think about the main audience for our work here at this meeting, or more broadly, you will probably arrive at an answer to this question: what is the main target audience? That it is ourselves, in part, legal and forensic psychologists, and also the law, which raises a question, for the outside audience, what effect has our scholarship had on the law? And I think that Costanzo and Krauss summed it up well when they said that psychology's attempt to influence the legal system have produced mixed results. You can see this readily if you just look at the results of some recent US Supreme Court opinions and you contrast what's happened recently with an eyewitness memory case where Sherry Berkowitz and colleagues wrote an article titled, "It's Not You, It's the Law, Eyewitnesses Memory Scholars' Disappointment with Perry versus New Hampshire," with a series of Supreme Court cases starting with Roper, where it seemed that the court was paying keen attention to science, especially neuroscience, but really the neuroscience gave wings to some of the behavioral research that we have on the relationship between adolescent development and juvenile justice. But I think it's fair to say that we're still at the stage where we sort of celebrate the instances where the law really takes heed of our work at those upper levels. And this is an overly dim perspective, but one that I still sort of like, that Jim Ogloff uses. Says the law uses psychology like a drunk uses a lamppost, more for support than illumination. That complaint is not restricted to judges or the courts or any level. It may as easily apply to other groups, including policymakers. And there are many, many reasons that we have difficulty influencing the law and legal policy. I'm not going to go into that. Instead, I'm going to say that it's often the case that real change occurs in law or policy after some disaster that creates a teachable moment. And the trick is to have a relevant body of research that can be used during that moment to affect change, to be prepared, to be adaptable. So one way to accomplish that is by really targeting a broader audience as we conceptualize the questions that we want to address, getting beyond ourselves and the courts. So for a marketplace of ideas, we do want to move from the courts to legislators and policymakers, and from legal or forensic psychology, which really is our discipline, to psychological science as a whole. For a variety of reasons, it's a bad idea to have the primary market be only us or only the courts. You can just consider for a moment handwriting experts or hair analysis, or the science article about whether forensic science is an oxymoron. I don't think that we are in that boat because we do focus on science, but it's to underscore the point that having a broad marketplace for ideas is key. I think it also frees us in a number of ways, to go beyond the role of serving the court or testing assumptions of the existing regime, which are often false and need to be unmasked. That's certainly important work. To also thinking about problem solving and innovating, coming up with new solutions in some ways. This is a more proactive approach, and I think that it will leave us better prepared for some of those teachable moments. The second point, beyond targeting a broader audience, is to tackle bigger problems. So taking some of that freedom to think more broadly about psychology and law. So this is the mission of APLS, to enhance the well-being, justice, and human rights through the science and practice of psychology in legal context. Jeremy Blumenthal, among others, has pointed out that the legal system does not solely consist of the criminal process or even criminal or civil trial, that there really is no limit to the scope of inquiry available to legal psychologists. He said, to the extent that every law has as its purpose the control or regulation of human behavior, every law is ripe for psychological study. Many pressing social problems here, today, now, are being studied by psychologists and are relevant to law and policy. Some of these will seem far-flung, but I will throw them out there anyway. They include things like, if I can get this to work, they include things like environmental protection. So thinking broadly, there are big interdisciplinary teams out there that include psychologists and are doing work on how behavior contributes to climate change and how to change the drivers of those contributions through changes in policy and law. That seems really out there. There are also opportunities to study income inequality. Again, we have psychologists that are focusing on the effects of income inequality on health, mental and physical health, as well as behavior, and this is directly relevant to welfare, labor market, tax policy, et cetera. And obesity has been called the next frontier of public health law. And there are different dimensions on which this can operate. One is weight discrimination law on one hand. On the other hand, food regulation, which is becoming an increasing focus of concern. This is clearly relevant to psychology because a lot of the problem is attributable to behavior change. So it's interesting to think about what kind of optimal defaults would be the most important to build into policy or law to change behavior. You will actually find a presentation on obesity here at APLS, I am happy to say. So we are getting at some of these closer edges of our discipline. Also, Michael Lamb, in his inaugural article for Psychology, Public Policy, and Law, encouraged us to think about big problems, and he highlighted a number of other areas that would be important for us to address. So again, beyond the criminal domain to public policy and civil law debates on issues that he said are diverse as adoption, fostering, placement, child welfare intervention, reproductive rights, especially as they relate to adolescence, educational policy, especially in relation to children with special needs or behavioral problems, and mental health treatment writ broadly. So those are some examples of some bigger problems that I think clearly involve psychology, law, public policy, but may seem far-flung from what we're currently interested in. We could also tackle some bigger problems that are right here at home in terms of what we focus on in criminal justice. As one example, there is disproportionate minority confinement. There's a lot of work to suggest that we very disproportionately incarcerate, confine, et cetera, Black Americans. But very little of that work finds its way into our organization. There is some good work on it, but it is clear that people like Tonry, Jack Glazer, et cetera, have done analyses to indicate that part of the problem is attributable to bad legislation early on that relates to the war on drugs, and this generally has bloated our prison population, but it also indicates that practitioner biases play a role. And those are less at the level of the courts than they are at the level of police practice, where they patrol in terms of inner city drug markets, and explicit and implicit biases, which psychologists tend to study. So people are beginning to talk about solutions to this problem and to do research on this, and I think we should have them with us, and that we should do more of that kind of work. The other thing that I'll highlight that's very close to home is we have very little work that focuses on treatment that could interrupt cycles of offending, despite the fact that we focus very deeply on offending and identifying who is at greatest risk for that problem. One example is the downward extension of measures of psychopathy from adults to adolescents. The reason for that we kept promoting was that this would allow us to focus on early intervention, but there is very little focus on that. Most of it is on risk assessment. Again, we are looking at some treatment issues. About 1 in 8 of the articles that were sort of clinical forensic focused on treatment, but most of the focus, again, is on sort of mental health law issues and offenders with serious mental illness. There are 2 very exciting exceptions to that by Randy Salikin, I'm not sure if he's here, and Daryl Kraemer, but we need more of that kind of work. So that is about tackling bigger problems. They can be close to home or they can be very far-flung and new to us. The last point is that it's really important for us to work explicitly to make interdisciplinarity real. Ostensibly, we're psychology and law, but in reality, law has become pretty marginalized in our organization. As I noted earlier, this is precisely the wrong direction to move if we want to have impact. We have a legal scholars committee. They are working on this issue, and we have some two great panels here. But there's also interdisciplinarity writ more broadly. The National Academy of Science in 2004, so this is not a new thing, said that research is truly interdisciplinary when it's not just pasting 2 disciplines together to create a product, but rather as an integration and synthesis of ideas and methods. So we need to better involve empirically minded legal scholars in the most obvious sense. Also, public policy analysts. There are people who are doing amazing work that is directly relevant to what we do. And scientists from other disciplines that impact on big social problems. We need multidisciplinary teams if we're going to really tackle complex social problems that cross levels of analysis. Team science has become a field now. People like Dan Stokels have done research on what makes teams work together and when they don't work very well together. And that could help address some of the problems that we have talked about since the inception of this field about controversies in the interaction between law and psychology. So there's a lot of information now that could help us leverage these sorts of resources. In fact, right now, the National Research Council, 2014, is finishing a consensus study on the science of team science, which they describe as a field that empirically examines the circumstances that facilitate or hinder the effectiveness of collaborative research. So there are initiatives on understanding how these teams connect, so how they come together in the first place. One of the biggest problems is that not much happens after that. They sort of bump and run. So there's a lot more focus on how to really collaborate over the long run to achieve scientific breakthroughs that you really couldn't attain as any one discipline alone. So those are 3 examples of directions that I think that we could focus on. They're very quick examples. We could certainly develop any one of those and have a much longer conversation. So target a broader audience, tackle bigger problems, and make interdisciplinary real. But to make this less abstract and a little bit more concrete, I thought I'd share just one potential example of a direction that we could go that really represents tiny, tiny baby steps. It's not very far removed from what we do already, but it would involve a move from a focus on assessment, forensic assessment, violence risk assessment, to causal mechanisms that we could focus on to reduce risk. I want to start by giving you a little bit of context or background. We have begun a big period of reform, I think, in crime regulation. The most notable sign of this is prison downsizing. This is happening in a number of places, some more than others. But you can see in this graph, which plots the total sentenced prison population from 1978 to 2012, you can see from this graph that this is not news. We know that mass incarceration policies have been alive and well for a number of years. What is news is that we're starting to see a modest downtick. And for the first time, total admissions to prisons are now being outpaced by releases from prison. So this is really, I think, the beginning of a sea change. And if you look at specific jurisdictions or if you look at California, or if you look at the 15 states that have actually closed prisons, you will see much clearer signs of this than you see at the aggregate level. But I think it's fair to say that we are in a period of change when it comes to crime regulation. These are really exciting times, and I think that Joan Petersilia put it well when she said that in many ways this has been brought on by what she calls the perfect storm. There are three elements. The first element is the one that we all know, which is that we became broke in 2007. So there was a fiscal crisis, there's a lot of budget awareness of prison spending, and that created some calls for reform. But that wouldn't have been possible without the second element, which is that crime rates have been coming down since the mid-90s, which really allows the left and the right to converge and get behind this notion of doing something differently. The third element is that there have been advances in research, but the research that is most cited when we're talking about this sea change is research that we have less to do with directly as an organization, and that is research that indicates that there are community-based alternatives that are very promising in terms of their ability to reduce risk. That is a body of research that started with Canadian correctional psychologists and scholars like Ed Latessa, who gave a really great talk here yesterday. And a number of us are taking some of that risk needs responsivity literature and running with it. So I want to be clear that we do have something big to contribute that we can claim ownership on with this movement, and that is risk assessment technology. We have to make decisions about which offenders to release, which offenders to keep in prison, and this organization has been very centrally involved in developing a number of risk assessment tools that can be used for exactly that purpose, and it's an important purpose. What we are less prepared to offer, though, is new knowledge on when and how to intervene. So we can certainly identify the high-risk people who will probably remain under correctional supervision and the ones who treatment research says should be the subject of intensive supervision and intensive intervention. But as an organization, we've done a bit less to say, well, what do we do now? Because that's really the focal point of the problem. Unless we do something different that is also better in reducing recidivism, this probably is not something that's going to be sustainable. So what I want to do for a moment is just speculate about what we might have had to offer if we had taken seriously Heilbronn or Ogloff or Otto's admonitions to go beyond risk assessment to really get into risk reduction. I also want to illustrate how we can kind of step out of traditional clinical realms and modes of research to shed more light on this issue. The focus is on causal risk factors. So I know that many of you don't do risk assessment research, but there has been little focus on risk factors that are actually causal when it comes to involvement in violence and criminal behavior. There's a lot of rhetoric in the field about criminogenic needs and dynamic risk factors, et cetera, but really a causal risk factor has to meet these two criteria. First, we have to be capable of changing it through intervention, so it has to be a variable or changeable risk factor. And two, when changed through intervention, when deliberately changed, the change can be shown to change the risk of recidivism. The most compelling type of evidence for risk factors being causal would be a randomized controlled trial where a targeted intervention was shown to be effective in changing a risk factor, and that change reduced the likelihood of recidivism. But the point that John Monahan and I recently emphasized is that it is nearly impossible to locate such randomized controlled tests of causal risk factors for recidivism. Criminal thinking patterns and substance abuse probably come the closest, but that's pretty narrow. I think that if we let go of some of our standard protocols for studying violence risk and returned to the greater field, we would be able to offer some new points of interest for the justice system. And this actually goes back to Carl Lewin, who is probably a hero for most of us. This will require that we go back to theory, that we have strong theory, and that we actually do something to test theories of change in randomized controlled trials. So Lewin is the father of action research. He said there is nothing so practical as a good theory, and if you want truly to understand something, try to change it. There is a Lewinian renaissance happening now in the field of social psychology. In Redirect, the surprising new science of psychological change, Timothy Wilson focuses on really interesting contributions that social psychology has made to understanding and then fixing social problems. This includes some of Walter Mischel's really amazing recent work, where he's gone far beyond Bandura. So basically, he's taking observational learning into a new realm. And as one example of his work, he's shown that there are interventions that can improve intertribal trust in Rwanda by modeling cooperative intergroup relations through radio soap operas, which sounds like magic, but it really is harnessing what he's learned about observational learning and taking it into the field with very applied teams. Also, Greg Walton at Stanford has distilled research on what he calls wise interventions. Wise interventions are different than what we conceptualize as clinical interventions. These are ordinary, brief, precise interventions. They are aimed to really change the way that people think and feel every day to help them flourish. So they're really aimed at recursive processes that can really compound over time to create lasting change. That's one of the reasons that wise interventions can be so powerful when they come during key points of development. They can have effect on everybody, but may have a special effect when people are in windows of real plasticity. So as one example that you may know, James Pennebaker has shown that undergrads who write about the most traumatic experience in their entire life for 20 minutes a day for a few days actually tend to find meaning in the trauma, which is the proposed mechanism, and they have been shown to have improved immune function, reduced doctor visits, etc. So again, these are interventions that seem magic, but you can read either of these sources for example after example after example of how theoretically based small changes can produce larger effects. And for those of you who think that's totally irrelevant to what we're talking about, there are clear signs that this is relevant to our field as well. It is not a panacea by any means, but a promising way of promoting some change. Disinhibition is one of the characteristics that we often see among people who are repeatedly involved in violence and other sorts of crime. And we have lots of traditional treatments that focus on disinhibition by trying to use a top-down strategy, which is stop and think. So we have cognitive behavioral programs that are built on that. But there's clearly room for innovation based on an understanding of the processes by which disinhibition can promote violence and other criminal behavior. So there's some example that automatic cognitive and emotional processing, which is some of what I think Bruce Perry was talking about, automatic cognitive and emotional processing predicts whether disinhibited people are going to act out under certain conditions a lot more strongly than reflective processing, the more stop and think strategies. This basically suggests that if you could do interventions that shift biases and implicit cognition or get at some hot automatic processing, you may be better able to affect behavior change that people use in the moment. It's much more bottom up. In proof of this principle, Ian Penton-Voak and Marcus Munafo in a Psych Science article described a really sort of groundbreaking study of high-risk juveniles where the goal was to modify youth's automatic tendency to interpret ambiguous emotional expressions as angry and thereby reduce reactive aggression. Fear biting is a way to think about it. In a series of 4 sessions, so 4 sessions, 4 days, they trained these adolescents to change the way that they were processing facial information. So in a series of 4 sessions, the juveniles were shown composite images of happy, which you see here on the left side. They were shown composite images of happy, angry, or emotionally ambiguous facial expressions, which you see in the middle, and asked to classify them as happy or angry. And they found what we often find in these studies, which is that these kids who were at risk had an attribution bias, in the sense that they were very likely to perceive neutral faces as hostile. But we know that already. The interesting part of what they did is that after they established a youth baseline point, which could be indicated here, they then did an intervention. They trained these adolescents. So they shifted the balance point, in essence, for perceiving ambiguous faces as angry. So they used feedback about whether the youth was correct or incorrect in classifying things as happy or angry to push their automatic processing in a prosocial direction, so that they're judging more neutral faces as happy post-baseline than they were doing before. And again, this is 4 brief sessions. What they found in this randomized controlled trial was that compared to the kids who didn't get this type of enhanced training, that those who were assigned to the treatment condition had a greater shift in their emotion recognition processes during the experiment, and less self and staff-rated verbal and physical aggression during a follow-up period that was short, 2 months, but still important. So with a team, we're beginning to test whether these sorts of interventions maximize behavior change for high-risk kids if they're provided during early to mid-adolescence. This is the interdisciplinary part. There's research in neuroscience to suggest that we can leverage this aspect of wise interventions that tells us we need to try to get at recursive processes that can produce lasting change, which means that targeting particular periods of development might be especially important. So I won't walk you through this model, but this is a model that's summarized by Krohn and Dahl that tells us what the state of the science is really on the teenage brain. It's not the teenage brain, because puberty is happening at age 10, in essence, for boys now. So when I say early to mid-adolescence, I'm talking about ages 9 to 13. So the notion is there are a number of biological changes that happen during the pubertal period that really sensitize kids to their social world and create tendencies for them to explore and engage. And these tendencies can confer some risk, some vulnerability to risk-taking behavior, and that's what's been emphasized so far. That adolescents are different and they're more prone to risk-taking, and for that reason are less culpable. But the neuroscience also suggests that this can confer adaptive advantages, that adolescents actually do some things better than adults, and that this is, in particular, a time of learning for social and affective learning, where learning about trust, learning about empathy, learning about patterns of automatic behavior in response to specific cues could really have an impact. So this timing issue is policy relevant. If we're able to tell the field not only what kinds of things to target, but also when to intervene if they really want to create an inflection point in behavior for kids that are pretty high risk for repeated involvement in the justice system, this is something that they would be very interested in. So that is just an example. Again, I wanted to give you something concrete, but it represents baby steps. This is baby steps in the sense that it doesn't move very far from a topic that we already study. It goes from an overstudied topic, frankly, risk assessment, to an understudied topic, treatment. It's still in the domain of criminal justice. The target audience is fairly broad. It includes not just the courts or legal psychology, but also psychological science, law, policy writ large. And it is interdisciplinary in the sense that it leverages neuroscience and also, although I didn't talk about this, areas of law that have to go beyond juvenile justice, criminal justice to involve child welfare, because we're talking about different groups at this point. So the point that I'm trying to make is that we can do this. I think we can apply really considerable talent that we have to innovate psychology and law in small ways. I think that we can attract people from the world that is relevant to us to innovate in larger ways, and that we can work with them. But the thing is, I don't think we will get there unless we as an organization take action to develop a vision and really focus on trying to reach that vision and again, invest in making it happen. We have resources in APLS, and in my opinion should really start trying to figure out where we can push the field in new directions that we want to go, that we want to define us as a field. And I'm actually going to end on this note. I hope we have plenty of time for conversations. But the note is that I think that broadening the field, continuing to do what we do and do well, but also broadening it to encompass larger social problems, to make us more relevant to larger fields, would be a good thing, not just for our field, but also for us as scientists. J.D. Watson, who discovered the structure of DNA, the double helix, has a beautiful article that you should read if you haven't, that was published in Science years ago. He articulated 3 principles for succeeding in science. One of these principles was to work with people who are smarter than you are, which ideally from other disciplines. So that was his tongue-in-cheek way of saying that it really is important to work in teams. The second principle that he offered was that you should always have a sure thing in your repertoire. So you should always make sure that you have a fallback program of research. And I think that we are well prepared to continue doing things that we know will have gain. But the point that he underscored, the winner for him, was to take risks. So really testing some truly out there hypotheses that are high risk, likely to be refuted, but also likely to produce very great returns. So basically, I'm encouraging you and us to do exactly that, to take risks. And I think that we might just promote greater social change along the way. Salim Shah, who is one of our founders and a hero to a number of us, said that perhaps the basic challenge for social science in its interactions with legal and social process is to build relevant knowledge and skills to bear on major social inequities so that the policies and practices in our society can more truly comport with the deepest notions of what is fair and right and just. And I will end on that note.